Hello everyone, welcome to CultureTalk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today we're exploring why audience numbers haven't fully recovered post-COVID, whether the cultural sector is stuck in outdated thinking, and how venues can better connect with audiences that are coming through their doors. To help us unpick these questions, I'm joined by Katy Raines, CEO of Indigo, an audience specialist who has been working with cultural organisations for 18 years. Indigo has established itself as a leading voice in audience research and development, with their expertise spanning audience development strategies, marketing strategies, and comprehensive audience insight across the cultural sector. Beyond individual consultancy, Indigo runs hot topic research. These are surveys that get hundreds of venues asking their audiences questions about things like sustainability, accessibility, and what they actually want from their cultural experiences. This work has influenced everything from the South Bank's groundbreaking Multitudes Festival to helping venues understand why their audiences might not be coming back for return visits, and more importantly, who their new audiences actually are. So hi, Katy.
Hello.
Before we dive into audience development, I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey and why you decided to focus on the cultural sector. And more importantly, what does the cultural sector mean to you?
Well, I'm lucky enough to have been brought up in Liverpool, where I was told from a very early age that everyone is musical. So if you're from Liverpool, everyone's in the school choir, because if you're from Liverpool, everyone can sing. Don't be daft, of course you can sing. So even though I came from a relatively working class background, music in particular was always very much part of my life from being a very small child to now. You know, I'm still singing now. So my parents, you know, my grandfather was a miner in Nottinghamshire. My parents were from a modest background, but my grandparents sang opera and my grandmother sang the Messiah. So, you know, music was just part of their lives. It wasn't seen as something just for posh people. It was available to them. And so it was always available to me. So I was very lucky that culture and music and the arts was just very much part of my life, even though I didn't look like the sort of person who should be. It should be part of their life. So for me, I was lucky enough then to, even though I went to a comprehensive school, I was lucky enough to be able to study music at Cambridge University and met a whole load of people and experiences that just opened my eyes to kind of music and the performing arts. So I've sort of seen both sides of it. I've seen how culture can be really kind of meaningful and true to people who perhaps have no background in it. And I've seen the kind of other end of the spectrum where, you know, very privileged and elitist people have access to that. And I think it's important to me. The cultural sector, I think, has huge, I think increasingly, power to change lives and change narratives and change stories. And for me, I want to see that happen for everyone. And you know, to be part of trying to make that happen for everyone is a real privilege.
You touched on some topics there, which I really am very excited to dive into with you later when you've alluded to class. But before we get into that, I'd love to learn a bit more about why did you choose to focus so much on audience research in particular?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because partly I'm very nosy. So I'm just inherently nosy. So I just want to know what people think and why they're doing what they're doing and stuff. But when I started working in arts marketing, because I'd done a music degree, I actually ended up working in theatre. So I didn't have an English degree or a theatre background. And I ended up being marketing director of a theatre. And it felt to me like everybody was talking a different language. There were sort of assumptions made about, oh, of course, you know this play, you know that play, and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I don't know what they're talking about. And that extended into knowing how to market things. So when I started off, it felt to me like, God, there's this sort of hidden code about what marketing I should be doing and what I should be saying and which tools I should be using. And I kept going, how do I find this out? Because everybody else seems to know it and I don't. And so because I'm quite mathsy as well, I kind of thought, right, well, I can't figure out what that is. So I'm going to go and try and find some evidence to help me with this problem. So I started off looking at box office data and going, what can that tell me? You know, who's coming to what, and are there any patterns in that? And then that extended into, well, perhaps if I ask the audience what they think, maybe that will help me. And I realized quite quickly that for the majority of work that was being talked about and marketed, nobody was asking those questions. It was all just done on hunch and on, well, that's the way we've always done it, or that's what the artistic director says it is, so it must be true. And so this sort of evidence-based approach to marketing, I kind of stumbled into because I didn't know where else to look. And I didn't feel confident making it up. So I sort of looked for places, and obviously audience research and audience data was the logical place to start. And in a way, I became a bit of a pioneer for that, and I hadn't realised that I had, because other people were then coming to me, going, how do you use that data? And I was like, well, you just do this and you look at this. But it was definitely better than hunch.
And obviously, you know, a lot has probably changed over that time, and I wondered how your perspective on audience research in the sector has changed over 18 years.
I think, thankfully, I think it has improved. As I say, there was a lot of hunch, and that's how it's always been done, and we'll just do it this way or whatever. And I think I'm old enough to really remember the advent of box office systems really coming in and transforming the sector, because before that there really wasn't anything else. So I think the first sort of shift was into actually having some data on our audiences and behavioural data on our audiences. You know, has this person been before? What have they been to? How do we spot when somebody has lapsed? You know, all of those things, we take that for granted now. But I can remember getting so excited about having all this box office data. And I used to have to set reports running overnight just to find out how many people were on my database. So I'd set it off at night before I went home, put a massive sticker on the thing for the cleaners, say, do not switch off. And then I'd come in the morning and there'd be a single number on the screen. And that was the number of people I had on my database. And it had taken all night to run it. And if the cleaners did switch it off by mistake, or there'd been a power cut, I had to then set it all going the next night. So I think, you know, we completely take for granted the way that we've got data at our fingertips now, but that's what it was like back in the olden days. And so that was the first kind of advent of trying to understand what data we had. And at the time, I can remember saying to people when they launched Tesco Club Cards, you know, we've got better data than this in the arts on our customers. We don't have to give people a plastic card and offer them loyalty points. People just give us their name and address when they book, and we've got their book of behaviour. It's brilliant, and we could do so much with it. So I think that's changed massively. And then I think there has been a shift, perhaps not enough, but there's been a shift to understanding the importance of the audience. You know, it very much used to be, well, we will put on our art and people are lucky enough to come to it. Yeah, I mean, it's not quite as bad as that, but there was a little bit of a whiff of that. And in some quarters more than others. But, you know, marketing, a lot of people were very uncomfortable with the word marketing in the arts, because marketing was something that Procter & Gamble did to sell toothpaste. You know, it's not something that we sully ourselves with in the arts. And we shouldn't need to sell what we do. You know, they should just come and be educated and be told what to do by us. You know, there was a bit of that. And to some extent, that was fine for the people in the know, but the people who hadn't had that experience in their background weren't in the know. And so marketing, arts marketing as such, and using research and using data definitely became more important. And things like, you know, the Arts Marketing Association, I remember the very first meeting of the Arts Marketing Association, the very first conference, because I'm that old. And this whole idea of professionalizing the industry and arts marketing becoming a profession, it's hard to imagine now that it wasn't. We were seen as the PR girls, if you were lucky, and we were mostly girls, and pretty much treated like there she is with the clipboard, and it wasn't seen as a profession or necessarily a skill in hopefully the way that it is now.
I mean, there's a lot of, and credit to the sector, because there's a lot of knowledge sharing available in the sector now. And I think that's very helpful to everyone. But is there still a resistance in the sector to listening to our audience and understanding their needs?
I don't think so, but I think it's easy just to hear the voices that shout the loudest.
Mm.
And I think the danger is, if you're in a busy marketing department, you're in a busy organization, the people that talk to you the most and the people that talk to your superiors the most, the artistic director or the chief exec or whatever, the people that are there in the foyer chatting to them, the people that are on the friends committee, people that give the most money, those are the voices that you can hear the loudest sometimes. Wonderful, but they're usually that much of the audience. They're like maybe 2 or 3% of the audience. But I think the danger is thinking that those people represent the whole audience. So I think there is a genuine desire to listen to and understand audiences. I think we just have to try a bit harder at listening to all the voices and almost eliciting responses from the people who perhaps wouldn't necessarily shout at all, if we genuinely want to try and understand our audiences. Because if you program for that tiny 2 or 3%, or you only listen to that 2 or 3%, you're missing a massive opportunity, for one thing, and they are not representative of your whole audience.
And this obviously leads us quite nicely into Indigo, and the fantastic research that you and your organization do with missing audience research and the Tomorrow's Audience research. Let me start with a question that's been causing some debate in the sector. Should cultural organizations stop obsessing over getting their old audiences back and focus entirely on new ones that are actually turning up?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there was real panic, wasn't there? About a year, 2 years after COVID, when we could see, and we saw this from the missing audiences research, that there was a whole swathe of audiences who just hadn't been back at all. And even the audiences that, or the traditional, most loyal audiences, that even those who had been back were saying to us and to all the organisations that were sending out our surveys, that their intention was to come less frequently than they had been coming. And I think one of the reasons I think it hit the sector so hard was because we'd had this small percentage of people, these people that I'm talking about, the voices that we heard, attending very frequently. And so that tiny proportion of people was representing a huge amount of the tickets we were selling. And even them coming a bit less frequently had a really disproportionate effect on ticket sales, because, some of them didn't come back, about a third didn't come back at all. And most of them that did come back were coming back less frequently and intended to come back less frequently. So we didn't really have a choice about having to diversify our audience. We had to lean towards getting new audiences. But here's the funny thing, that actually organisations are pretty good at getting new audiences, always have been. So the issue for me, the question you're asking for me is slightly the wrong question, in that it's not, do we get the old ones back again, or do we get new audiences? For me, the big prize is, how do we get those people that find their way to us as new audiences? How do we get them back again? Because we know from our data, something like 50% of people who come through the door for the first time never come back again. And we know that the average across all the organisations we work with anyway, is about 75 to 80% of the audience comes once a year and doesn't come more frequently. So if we could get even 5, 10% of those people back just once more in a year, that would make the biggest difference. And, the old adage of it's 5 times more expensive to get a new customer than to keep an existing one. I would argue that's the low-hanging fruit, is the people who've actually made it through the door, but for whatever reason haven't come back again. And we definitely need to, that's where the focus should be, in my opinion.
And what impact is the cost of living crisis, which has been exacerbated since COVID, had an effect on that? People are looking to cut costs, especially when arts and culture is often seen as a luxury for many people, although I think there's an argument to that for society. But how should the sector contend against those kind of financial pressures that people are dealing with in their personal lives?
I mean, I think the kind of simple answer is to look at price, but it's not about price, is it? It's about value, and it's about cost in terms of time, and value for time, and value for money. And I think that what we've seen since COVID is sometimes people are prepared to spend a bit more money on an amazing experience and perhaps go a bit less often, but make it a bigger thing. And I think the other thing that we've noticed is that people are looking for more human experiences, that actually being somewhere in the flesh has so much more value. A football ticket now, being in the ground at the match, has so much more value to people than watching it on the television. It never used to be like that, but it's like that now. It's like, I was actually there. And so I think we need to, it's really difficult, I think, to on the one hand, lean into it's a big night out, it's a luxury experience, it's worth the money, you would pay this money for Taylor Swift, all that kind of argument, versus those, little arts centres and things that are never going to be able to offer the big night out like that, and trying to persuade people that it needs to be part of their everyday lives, as I was talking about earlier. And I think it's really hard to get that messaging right. But at the heart of it has to be us making a better case for why culture and the arts, and maybe those aren't the right words to be using, maybe it's about creativity and about innovation and about well-being even, that those things are important, and that what we do can really help people with those so that they become more important to them. And we know that if they're more important to people, they will commit time and money to them. In a cost of living crisis, you prioritize. And the danger is that if we're not relevant enough, we become irrelevant, and then we just fall to the bottom of the list. And that, I would hate to see that happen.
Perhaps a good case study around that is the work you did with Southbank on their Multitudes Festival, which succeeded by designing around some of these new audience insights that you guys uncovered. Why aren't more venues following their lead, and how should they follow their lead?
Well, I mean, the Multitudes thing was absolutely fascinating because Mark Ball, the artistic director, had a chat with us, and he said, I want to create a new strategy for music, this organisation that starts with the audience. And it's very rare that somebody comes to us and has that, who genuinely wants to have that conversation. And it was just so refreshing. Now, the Southbank, he definitely sees, I don't want to speak on his behalf, but I think it's fair to say that he definitely sees the Southbank Centre as kind of, the nation's arts centre, and it's their job to lead the sector, and they are funded to do that. And they were given money by the Arts Council for this Multitudes Festival to do that. And he sees that very much as his responsibility. So in a way, they were being funded to take risks and to innovate in this space, almost on behalf of the sector. And Mark took that responsibility very seriously. So I think it would be unfair to suggest that every arts organisation is in the position to do that. I also think that as a sector, research and development, and I don't mean audience research, I mean proper R&D, innovation, is not funded enough. And I think if we want to see changes in audience experience and real innovation in how we offer different opportunities for audiences, it's got to be funded. Because you talk to any entrepreneur and they will say, okay, so we tried 10 things and only one of them worked, if they're lucky. And we had to throw a lot of jelly at the wall before we found one that stuck. And there's this term, as you'll know, in tech about failing fast. Let's try lots of ideas. Let's try them all in beta. And then, oh, that one doesn't work, that one doesn't work, that one doesn't work. I think if everything has to succeed, which is often the position you're in, if you're in a regional venue and you say, I want to try something different, and then it doesn't work, well, what happens? You probably don't get the chance to try something else because you couldn't afford to do that and it fail. So you can't afford to do anything else. And yet probably we need to throw 100 bits of jelly at the wall to find the one that is really the answer and is going to help us. So I think I want to see Arts Council and other funders and philanthropists invest much more in this jelly throwing, as I'll call it. And then with organisations who, like Mark and the South Bank Centre, are then really open and willing and generous to share their findings and their experiences with the rest of the sector. And that's the wonderful thing about working in this sector, because people generally are happy to do that.
Yeah. I'd like to move on to skills development within the sector now, because I think it's something that Indigo helps kind of close the gap a lot with when you're working with organizations, because many organizations say they either lack the skills or the time or the budget for proper audience development. Yet you've built a community of hundreds doing exactly this work. So what's the real problem here? Is it resources or priorities when it comes to skills?
Well, look, I mean, I think since I started in arts marketing, I've seen websites be developed. I mean, when I started, there was no email and there were no websites. Okay, so there's always something new coming on. And as an arts marketer, you're always expected to keep up with that and do that. Oh, but don't stop doing anything that you're already doing. So you still have to do the posters, you still have to do the print, you still have to do the brochure, you still have to do the listings in the local newspaper or whatever it was. And then you have to build a website, and then you have to do email marketing. And of course, then it's social media marketing and all of this stuff. It's just layer upon layer, more stuff. And so I think not only does that mean that you end up de-skilling everybody, because everybody has to be brilliant at everything. But there's, and we saw after COVID, the number of jobs that everybody, the marketing manager job, oh, you're doing fundraising as well now, and you're doing this as well. So you have to do more with less. And it seems to be accelerating. The more and more and more you have to do with less and less. So in the way I've just described it, how on earth do we build skills in that situation? Because you can't possibly, well, there's a few people that are brilliant at everything, but the majority of us cannot be brilliant at all those things, or haven't got the time because we're so busy whacking moles on all of those things to get the skills we need. The latest one is AI, isn't it? So it's like, yeah, okay, AI could save you loads of time. And if I had a penny for every time somebody said to me, oh, well, if you just do that on ChatGPT, you'll save yourself half a day's work. Yeah, but I haven't got time to figure out how to use ChatGPT and all the ethical issues and concerns I've got about it and all. So either I won't bother or I'll just do it badly. So you end up being a bit of a jack of all trades, I think. And I think this for me comes down, your point about resources or priorities is about leadership, because it's got to be about priorities. But I don't think it's fair to put that on top of a marketing manager, on top of everything else they've got to do. I think this is about leadership in the sector to say, let's be really clear with our marketing staff what it is that we're trying to do and what it is we're not trying to do. And it's very rare to find an arts organisation that is prepared to say, we're not doing that, or we don't do that, because we've all been in this thing, you've got to do everything for everyone, accessible to all, of course, but does that mean you've got to be able to do everything for everybody all the time, 24/7? You can't. So I think for me, it's got to be about prioritisation, but that prioritisation has to be owned by the whole organisation. You can't leave it to the marketing manager to make those decisions. Not that they're not capable of it, but they're not given the agency to do it. So it has to come from the top. And that really, to me, suggests that the leaders of organisations need to really understand the importance of audiences. And when they do, in organisations where those leaders do, it definitely makes a difference. And you start to see organisations, marketing teams who have that clarity and focus and are allowed to not do things in order to be able to commit properly to other things.
I think you paint a really accurate picture there of, the struggles that people have in their working lives, especially in arts and cultural marketing. And I'm sure it's a message that people have kind of delivered up the chain to their bosses or bosses' bosses. But how can arts marketers better communicate this to their leaders in order to affect change?
I think my advice to anyone in that sort of marketing manager role is become the audience champion and become the audience specialist. And so if you know what your audience thinks about everything in that organization, and you can bring that to the decision-making table, even when they're not talking about marketing, then you are championing and modeling that behavior to everyone else. So they're making a decision about whether they're putting heat pumps in or something to do with sustainability, or they're making a decision that's nothing to do with marketing or even perhaps what's on the stage. What does the audience think about that? And if you don't know or can't find out or have an informed opinion on what the audience thinks about that, you're not the audience champion. So I think if marketers can see themselves in that role as the kind of conduit really for between the organization and the audience on all decision making, not just where to put a poster up or which social media channel to use or how to sell a show that's not selling or whether to discount the tickets or not, or even what to price them at, then I think you start to have a value in the organization and you start to be involved in conversations wider than marketing, and audiences start to be put at the center. And hopefully by modeling that behavior, I know I'm painting a very idealistic picture of it, but by modeling that behavior, and some of these people, as we know, go on to be chief execs themselves. And that's just a dream when somebody who's been in a marketing role and an audience champion then becomes the CEO or the exec director of an organization and really champions that from the top. It's just fantastic. It makes such a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we talk about segmentation now? You've mentioned to me before that some segmentation systems are becoming legacy tools and that past behavior is often the best predictor of future behavior. But with platforms now offering real-time personalization based on customer data rather than postcodes or demographics, how can cultural organizations better take advantage of these new tools?
I think it comes back to what we were saying about focus and prioritization, that I don't think the problem is the lack of tech or the lack of tools. I think in a way it's the opposite, that marketing people, they'll go to ticketing professionals or they'll go to the AMA or whatever it is they're going to, and there'll be all these tech providers there going, oh, we've got this. And you can be slightly overwhelmed, I think, by it all going, oh, I should be doing this, should be doing this. What does that do? And you can go off chasing bells and whistles and shiny things. And I think what we've got to try and instill is that focus. What is it we're trying to do with our audiences? And therefore, what do we need to know? What don't we know? What do we need to know? How can we use the data we've got, or what data do we need to go and get that we haven't got in order to help us with that? I think the number of times we have people come to us and go, right, we've got all this data and we want you to help us make sense of it. And I'm like, well, that's not the right question. What is it you're trying to do? And what data do you need to help you do that? What of that data have you already got, and what do we need to go and find out? Everything else is irrelevant. And half the time, going back to that, what you're not doing is a bit like cutting through a wood. It's like, right, get rid of that. You don't need that. It's just a distraction. It's just noise. Get rid of it. Focus in on what you need to know. So I think with segmentation, I think it's very easy to chase the latest shiny thing, to kind of go, oh, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. And how does that fit with that? And oh, but they're using that and I'm using this. And oh God, I don't know how it all works. And for me, it's about clarity. So, for example, what we do is when we look at audience insight, we say you need a really rounded picture of that. You need to understand the profile of the audience. Who are they? What are they like? And yes, some demographic stuff. You need to know how they're behaving, how they have behaved, how they behave in relation to you, how they behave in relation to other things they're doing in their leisure time. Their attitudes, you need to understand what they think, not just about you, but about the cost of living and their attitudes to, culture and leisure and what they do in their spare time and what they need. And then the impact that you're having on them or potentially could have on them, or the impacts they're looking for, the needs they are looking to be met. And if you can have all of that, you're then in a really strong position to say, okay, we understand all of that about our audiences or about potential audiences. How do we use the assets and resources we have as an organisation to meet those needs, to better meet those needs of those people? And how can we demonstrate to them that we can do that better than Netflix or better than a football match? I think the real danger is just not seeing the wood for the trees, because you're just blinded by, all of this data, all of these different models, things you feel you should be doing. Work out what you want to do as an organisation, work out where your problems are, how you think you can go forward, and focus in relentlessly on the data that's going to help you with that, and the segmentation that's going to help you with that.
I always see it as kind of like, I always split it up into kind of three categories when it comes to data. One is kind of understanding what you want to find out. The second is collecting that data. And the third is acting on it. And I feel that third thing, once you have all the information, the third part, acting on it, can sometimes be quite difficult, knowing, you built up a picture, but what's next? And how should people navigate that last part?
I think it is very difficult. As I say, I think if you've been really clear about your intention in the first place, why you need the data, what you would do with it if you had it, I think it's a lot easier to then go, okay, so we've got that information now. Here's the actions. I think it's easy to just have analysis paralysis and just keep going around in circles. And a number of times we'll kind of present an organisation or an individual with what we think is a really clear picture of what's going on. And they'll say, yeah, but what about this? And what about that? And we're like, no, focus on this. Yeah, but what about that 2% of people over there? No, don't look at that. Look at this. But I think the action as well, it goes back to the leadership question that, it might be really obvious to you as a marketing manager what you need to do with that information. But you may have no agency to be able to do that. And also, let's be realistic about this. If you're in a receiving venue, a regional receiving venue, say you discover from your audience that actually what they want is loads more contemporary dance, okay? That's what you discover. But there is no more contemporary dance. So you're not offered any of that as a regional receiving venue, or that product just isn't there. There's very little you can do about it because you're just at the end of the food chain as to what's available. And I think this is one of the kind of challenges of the kind of structural challenges of the sector since COVID, that because we've been struggling with audiences for all the reasons we've discussed, I think there's been less risk-taking, less innovation. And so the whole thing can just be dumbed down to the extent that people start painting by numbers in terms of their programming to just take safer and safer work. And then it becomes less and less relevant to people, and we become obsolete if we're not careful. But as the receiving venue, you don't have a lot of agency in that. So it requires the people like the South Bank to be at the other end, really pushing hard, so that by the time it gets down to us in the regions, there's interesting stuff available.
Yeah. And your segmentation work often uses behavioral attributes and traits rather than just demographic data. And maybe people use demographic data more because it's quite readily available in their systems. So why is behavioral data better when it comes to audience segmentation, and how can it be gathered when it's often quite qualitative instead of quantitative?
I think there's a real confusion in the sector about, people use the word segmentation and they use it interchangeably to mean population segmentation, so all the people in the population, and customer segmentation, so their own customers. And to me, they're very different things and you need different tools. So market or population segmentation is taking the whole population of, say, England or GB and segmenting them by their likelihood of attending the arts. Okay, we don't know who these people are, they're not on our database. So actually things like geo-demographic segmentation, where you look at certain areas and you use things like audience spectrum to find where there are people who are most likely to attend the arts in your local area, fantastic, because you don't know anything else about them. So it's really useful at going and finding, particularly geographically, those hotspots where those people who are into drama or music or whatever might be. Once they've booked a ticket and they're on your system, they are your customer. And that's where customer segmentation comes in, because the information you will have about that person, you've got their actual name and address, you've got their behavior on your database, you know what they've come to, how much they paid, did they buy any concessionary tickets, did they bring children? And that's even just off the booking. If you've then got survey data off the back of it and you've got something to do with attitudes and motivations and everything, you've got a much, much richer picture of that person than using their postcode to tell you what audience spectrum segment they're in. Isn't that useful? Really useful for finding new people, not so useful for talking to your existing people, because I don't know about you, but the people who live next door to me are nothing like me. So that's not terribly useful for one-to-one communication to persuade me to come back to your venue. Very useful if you're doing a door drop to find which areas might be most likely to respond to, to try and find new people. So I think it's horses for courses, really. And so what we do is start with the behaviour, because that is the best predictor of future behaviour as past behaviour, and layer up onto it the attitudinal stuff through the surveys, and looking at things like AI now and different ways of collecting data from customers that will really help us to make that much richer, so that we can then really target them with things that are appropriate to them personally, not just them as a resident of the suburb they happen to live in. So both have their place, but I think you have to use the right tool in the right context.
Great. I'd like to move it back to people and audiences again. You kind of touched on class a bit earlier, and I've got a bit of an uncomfortable question, which I think you might be able to help with, which is often kind of leveled at the sector, which is the cultural sector fundamentally elitist? And is that reputation limiting our ability to grow beyond the usual suspects?
I really want to believe that it's not. And certainly the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis, both at Indigo and in our client organisations, definitely don't fall into that category. I see people who have real desire and appetite, like myself, to make the arts as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. However, the structures of power and control in our country mean that many organisations, look at boards of arts organisations. How diverse are those boards? And I know the Arts Council is doing some fantastic work, and people like CLAW Programme, Leadership Programme are doing fantastic work to try and change that, because if the board is elitist or isn't representative, then they're not going to employ staff who are necessarily representative, and then it's going to be very, very hard for the people on the ground who are really trying to do that work to make a difference. I mean, I think things like there's also been some structural kind of funding decisions, I think, that have been problematic in this. And I don't know all the ins and outs, but, you know, as an example, when English National Opera's funding was cut by Arts Council England, and I'm not making a case for whether it should have been or not, but I just observed what happened. there was an absolute outcry, and lots of very important, powerful people made a big noise. Now, if I was marketing director or comms director of ENO, I would have done exactly the same, because it's my organisation and I want to save it. But I saw other organisations who were equally cut from the portfolio that year, who didn't have people on their board with the power and influence and the access to the, Telegraph and the media and the Times and all of those people, or the ability to stage big, massive comeback concerts and stuff, who didn't get reinstated or given lots of funding to move to Manchester. They didn't get that option. So I like to believe that we're not an elitist sector, but unfortunately, I think some of the structures could definitely be accused of that. I struggle to accuse the people who I come into contact with of that, but I think we need to make a bit more noise and work a bit harder at kind of toppling some of those, or challenging some of those power structures and the people that are in those positions, and just blatantly trying to get better, different people into those senior roles, which is hard, because how does somebody who's working class or from a working class background get themselves onto the board of English National Opera? I don't know. I hope they can, and maybe they have, but I don't know.
Do you think programming has a role to play in this? Obviously not all programming, but some shows can require a certain level of education to understand, the cultural context within a performance. Could programming be more diverse and accessible in terms of people from different educational backgrounds?
Well, again, I'm not sure I would agree with the premise that if you haven't had a certain education, that certain bits of programme aren't accessible to you. I think what stops them being accessible is the way that they are packaged up. And I don't just mean the marketing, I mean the whole customer experience and all the kind of language and imagery and constructs and dress codes and behaviours that are sort of put around that. So orchestral concerts are a good example of that. And I know, because I've worked with the South Bank, there's some fantastic work going on in the sector to try and break down some of these things. But we followed some non-attenders, people who'd never been to orchestral music before, into some classical music concerts in various venues. And we followed them in, and we did some focus groups with them. And these were people who were comfortable sitting on a seat for 2 hours. They went to other things. They went to theatre, or they went to pop music concerts or gigs. But you sent them to a classical concert and they were slightly mystified because of the kind of codified behaviours that there were in that environment. So the first thing is they go in and they sit down, and then the orchestra sort of start ambling onto the stage. And they're used to going to Taylor Swift, where there's this kind of moment of hush, and then there's like this build up, and then the bands start to come on the stage, and then there's the dry ice, and then there's this big moment when Taylor Swift arrives. Okay, now we can't all put on a Taylor Swift gig, but they just saw these sort of musicians chatting to each other, seemingly about what they'd had for their tea last night, onto the stage. And they go, and then they start playing their instruments, and they're going, why are they practicing? I thought they were supposed to be ready for this concert. Why are they practicing bits of the music that they're going to play? And I'm not trying to be funny here, but it must look very odd to people if that's not what they're used to. So that all happens, and then they shush, and then they start tuning up. So they were like, well, could they not done that before they came on stage? Why are they doing it now? Now, I'm a musician, I know why that is, but nothing was explained to them. It just all looks odd. Then this bloke walks on, and he's got a violin in his hand, and everybody claps him, and he bows, and then he sits down at the front of the orchestra. And they're like, right, who's he then? He hasn't done anything yet. Why are we clapping him? And then the conductor comes on, the same thing happens. And then some soloist comes on as well with, in a big frock. And so a lot of these sort of things, they're just mystified about. And then they sit in sort of reverential hush through the first piece. And there might be more than one movement, and there's the classic, I don't know whether to clap. And there was this amazing first movement. So at the end of it, they just wanted to get up and clap, and everybody just sat there quietly. And then at the end of the whole piece, they weren't quite sure whether it had actually finished or not, because it ended quite calmly. And as soon as it finished, there were people standing up and clapping, and they're like, but I don't understand why they're standing up and clapping then, when I wanted to stand up and clap earlier and nobody else did. So that's just an example of, I don't think it's the program that's the problem. The music itself, they were kind of going, oh, I got really transported and it felt like a film, and I really liked watching the musicians, and that wasn't the issue. The issue was that we built up a kind of whole series of rituals and codes around it that made no sense to them, and that nobody explained. So I think it's not about apologizing for what we do. I think that would be, and dumbing it down. It's about giving people a way into that, explaining what's going to happen, just so they know what to expect.
Yeah, I think engagement is key. And as you kind of shared some other research that you did, showing how audiences care about or are quite capable when it comes to sustainability or technology. So you did some research that looked into whether audiences wanted to be green volunteers or whether they wanted self-service for convenience. Are we systematically underestimating what choices our audiences want when it comes to visiting or engaging with our cultural organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a real danger of us doing that. And I think there's also a danger of us talking about the audience as if they're all the same. So what we saw with our self-service venue research was that the majority of people would really welcome self-service technology in venues, because they hate queuing. They hate having to choose between having a drink or going to the loo in the interval. And so if there's a way of them having a kiosk and being able to order their drinks, we had neurodivergent people saying, I get really stressed if I have to queue up and then ask for what I want in the way that I want it. I would actually find it much easier. So, but similarly, there are a group of people who say, no, I need personal service and I couldn't use a kiosk and I wouldn't want to use a kiosk. So there's more nuance to it. But I think, it's something like the self-service venue thing. If the majority of your audience, I can't remember what the percentage was, it was way over half of the audience would welcome that technology, by giving them the technology that they've said they would like, you're then actually releasing the staff to super serve the people who really want that personal service and prefer or need that personal service. And you're not getting rid of staff, you're just reorganizing things so that it's better for everyone. So I think it's an and, not an and or. I don't think it's this or this. I think you can actually do both. It's a bit more nuanced. And certainly with the communicating sustainability stuff, Act Green, we were really staggered at how much more environmentally active audiences wanted cultural organisations to be. I was really shocked, because I expected our audiences to be, just get on with what's on stage and, leave the woke stuff to other people, just entertain me. Wasn't the case at all. So it's a real surprise.
Yeah. I'm just a bit conscious of your time, so I'm just going to move on to the final questions, looking ahead in the sector. If you could wave a magic wand and change 3 things about how the cultural sector approaches audiences, what would they be?
Well, I think it's sort of recapping on what we said, really. Firstly, you need to listen to the unheard voices. You need to listen to not just the usual suspects, I think. Secondly, I think it's about really trying to understand and be clear about what the needs are of those people that you could meet or that you do meet. What are their needs? Are they stressed? Are they needing well-being tools? Are they needing escapism? Are they needing a big night out? What is it they need? And how can you deliver that for them better than other options that they might have. Really understanding, not understanding their demographics or their motivations, understanding their needs. And then thirdly, having the confidence and the knowledge and the data and the understanding of those audiences to then be that audience champion within the organization and to bring that audience voice into all the decision making that organization makes, not just marketing or pricing, but everything. And if you really truly understand what those audiences need, and I don't just mean the actual audiences, I mean the potential audiences, the people that in your community that you serve, what are their needs? Then you start having different questions in the organization, different conversations. How could we better meet those people's needs with the amazing resources that we have, the amazing creativity that we have as a sector? That for me, those would be the three things I would focus on.
Mm. And before we wrap up, what gives you most hope about the sector's future?
Well, I think two things that are potentially contradictory, actually. One is the advent of AI, because if we get this right, hopefully it could really help us with all the things I've talked about, giving that focus and clarity, saving time, cutting through some of the boring stuff, making sense of data. It could all be really, really exciting. I'm a realist, and I'm also fully aware of some of the ethical issues around AI, and it's something that we're exploring at the moment. But if I'm glass half full, that is quite exciting, and I think there's possibilities there. But I think the other thing is, as AI develops, I think the world is going to need more humans and more human-centered approaches to things, because we're all going to get sick of what AI tells us to do. And I think the future belongs to original thinkers and to the creatives and to the innovators. So, we need to be empowering our children, our innovators of the future, by giving them access to creative thoughts so they can learn to think differently now and not just be another AI, because they will be redundant if that's the case. But I've got great hope that, the creative sector is going to be the answer. It's going to be the antidote to AI, and it's going to be the answer to civilizations thriving in the future, because, creatives are the future, in my opinion.
I love that. That's a very inspirational way to end, and something I find great joy and hope in as well. But yeah, thanks, Katy, for your time. As someone whose work is always centered around people and audiences, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's a shame we have to end it, because I feel we've only just scratched the surface. So maybe we can dive a little deeper into some of these topics a bit more another time. But I particularly appreciate you not just sharing your research insights, but your willingness to answer some of the uncomfortable questions we have around the sector and audiences, and when it comes to audience development. For those interested in exploring these ideas further, Katy's work through Indigo includes not just the consultancy services, but also the Indigo Share platform that's giving venues real-time audience insights and benchmarking. You can learn more about their hot topic research and audience segmentation work at their website, indigo-ltd.com. Katy, is there anywhere else or any resources you'd like to direct people to who might want to learn more about audience development and audience research?
Well, the go-to place is always Culture Hive, isn't it, on the Arts Marketing Association's website? Absolutely fantastic. So dive into that, and I think they're building an AI front end. So you might even be able to put in, at some point, some questions, and it might come back to you with some, specific answers. So that's really exciting as well. So that's where I would always go first.
Great. And to our listeners, if you found today's conversation challenging in a good way, I'd encourage you to think about one thing you might do differently based on what we've discussed today. There's many kind of new ideas around audience research that are cropping up at the moment. But thank you again for your time and insights today, Katy. And thank you to everyone listening and joining us for another episode of Culture Talk. Until next time, take care and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.